But essentially, we're trying to take the kinds of visual search experiments that are done by psychologists using very abstract stimuli that don't really represent the real world and turn them into very realistic, naturalistic stimuli so we can investigate things like density of a forest, composition of an environment. And we're doing all that using computer science and computer graphics, which is where I come in. You can read the paper if you want to. We should get these, 2020 being what it is, we've been a bit delayed with these next two. So I said, our methods are based on the kinds of experiments that occur in visual search research, but we want to use stimuli modeled on the real world. So let's have a look at what's done in visual search at the moment or previously. Typically with visual search experiments, you might present participants with stimuli like this, and you may be asked, yes or no, respond as quickly and accurately as possible. Is there a red circle present? Now, in this case, we have what's called a pop-out effect. The target is either very obviously there, as in this case, or very obviously is not, as in this case. So you don't need to search the scene to find whether it's there or not. Your brain just processes the whole scene at once and you know the answer straight away. Participants' response time will typically not increase with the number of distractors. So in this sort of search, it does not matter how many of these distractors, green circles, we add. The thing you're looking for either obviously pops out or is obvious by its absence, okay? Now, there is another type of visual search that we're more interested in, serial search. Now, I've made a simple example for you on the left here, probably not the best one. You're being asked, is there a letter T present amongst the rotated letter Ls? Now, this time, more like how the natural world is, it may not pop out straight at you. You may have to visually attend to different parts of the scene until you find the target, and then you can respond. This is what's called a self-terminating search because you keep looking until you either find the target or have exhausted all of the objects, and then you stop. So in the case of this image, where it's the same, but there is no target there, you would have to look through each of them and then decide, no, there's no target. Unlike with the parallel search from just now with the red dots, participant response time typically does increase with the number of distractors, which makes sense. If we double the number of distractors in the scene, you now have to attend to more things before responding that the target is not present. If the target is present, it may be the first thing you look at, in which case you respond very quickly. It may be the last thing you look at after everything else, in which case your response will be slower. But on average, people will spot the target when they've looked at half of the objects present. It all basically cancels out if you run enough participants. And the question is, okay, that's all well and good, but how can you take these kinds of principles and apply it to more real world environments? We like having this level of control where we control how many distractors there are, whether the target is present or not, exactly how it's all arranged, but it doesn't resemble anything in the real world. And if we want to know about prey detection in certain environments, we need stimuli that can resemble those environments. So what we've started doing is using stimuli that look more like this. In fact, these are from the first experiment, first two. So I created a project which can generate these kinds of environments for you. So you look at the palynological data, the pollen data of a certain place at a certain time, say what taxa of trees or shrubs were present, how dense may they have been, and you can generate an environment very quickly to those specifications, which means we can now place a target like a red deer somewhere in the environment and then find out how much more difficult is it to spot in a grassland versus a wooded land, or how does density of the environment affect things. We decided in this particular experiment to keep this grass, which probably might have been better with a dark floor, but it was just one of the variable, not to be controlled at this time. So all environments have this kind of grass, because if we make the woodlands have the dark floor and the grasslands have grass, that's another difference between the two environments, although I do address this later on. So basically, we're doing the similar kind of, can you locate the target or not, but using these kinds of stimuli instead. Now, I will say, I haven't put it on the slides, but unlike with stimuli like this, if there's in a 3D scenario like this one, there's the possibility for the target to be hidden behind something. So the deer could be behind a tree. So it doesn't matter how good your eyes are, you're not going to see it because there's too much stuff in the way. And we did do some initial research, which I don't present here because this is just a very short talk, which shows that, right, if you drop 10,000 objects into an environment of a given size, and then you place a target object 100 meters away from where you're standing, here is the percentage chance that that will be hidden from view. And I can share that if you are interested. Okay, so what do we do with our stimuli? This is how our stimuli are presented to participants in the first experiments. The lower image shows you a complete image that will be displayed across all these 3 screens. The reason why it looks like there's a bit of tearing every third is because we have to take into account the gaps in between the monitors. But if you're a participant in our study, you'll be sitting in the middle of here where this table is. So you've got a complete 180-degree field of view, so you can turn your head to look left and right as you would do in the real world without having to wear any kind of head-mounted display or anything like that. These are 3 32-inch screens, and the reason why it looks a little bit blurry is this image is actually in motion. So as you'll see when I come to talking about experiment 1, the participant is actually moving forward through this environment trying to locate this deer. So let's have a little look what we did for our first experiment. So those are the kind of stimuli we are using. We made an experimental procedure where participants are passively moved forward at walking pace through the environment. So you start at one end of the environment and slowly move forwards. The participants are attempting to visually locate the deer. So they're looking around from left to right, trying to find where this deer is. Once they locate it, they can press the space bar to stop moving and then click with the mouse to say, I found the deer, it is there, or it's there. Now that can, I'll tell you what we're varying in the environment. So for this first experiment, just see whether this methodology makes sense at all, really. We had 2 different types of environments, wooded and grassland, which you can see examples of on the left, which varied the density of the objects, either 2,000, 5,000, 8,000, or 11,000 shrubs or trees per square kilometer. So you can make the environment as big as you want. And what we're measuring is the accuracy of participants' responses. So when they respond, they can give one of 3 responses. They can successfully locate the deer, in which case we record how far away were they at the time. They can misidentify the deer. So they can say, I found the deer, there it is, and click on some bush in the far distance. And then, how often does that happen in various environments? Or they can not respond at all. So they can go all the way through the environment, never spot the deer and not respond. So what we're interested in, how do these different treatments for the environment affect people's abilities at locating these animals? I think I've explained everything on there. Yep. And here we find this initially. By looking at running lots and lots of participants in lots of our environments, we find some reliable trends. There is a very reliable effect for environment type. So if you have a grassland and a forest of the same density, at least in this, people can on average locate deer at 53 meters further in a grassland than for a forest. There is a very reliable effect for the density. So it's common sense, as you might expect, as an environment gets more and more and more dense with trees, shrubs, whichever objects, people have a harder time locating these animals. And the interaction between these two is such that the effect of the environment type is much more pronounced at lower densities. So when you've got a very sparse grassland and a very sparse forest, the difference in average prey detection distance between these two will be greater than in a very dense environment, presumably because in a very dense environment, the object can be completely hidden from view a little bit more. So this is what we found initially. This was all worked out using linear mixed effects, modeling, and some statistics. It's all in the paper how we arrived at all this, just to give you an overview. As for participants' responses, this ended up being not so significant, but it's quite interesting that in all of the environments that were very sparsely populated with objects, nobody ever failed to respond at all. So in these 2,000 dense, as I would call them, environments, participants always responded saying, yes, I found the deer, there it is. But they could be wrong. They could click on something that wasn't the deer. Maybe they've misidentified a patch of tree or a distant shrub and responded incorrectly. But generally, throughout all the different environments of all different combinations of woodland, grassland, at all different densities, participants were able to respond and successfully locate the deer. It's just the distance at which they were reliably able to do that varied a lot. But it did turn out that you can use density and environment type as a predictor of how someone's going to perform, but you can't use density and environment type to predict whether they will make a mistake and misidentify the deer or not respond, at least not in our experiment 1. But of course, environments in the real world, as I mentioned, if you think of a region going through a period of climatic cooling, such as during stage 3, various Dansgaard-Oskar events and things, it's not like all of the trees suddenly turn into shrubs or the other way around. You have an environment that transitions, so it starts off very wooded. Then as the climate deteriorates, it becomes much more open and gives way to much more shrubs and shorter plants. So experiment 2 was designed. This is very like experiment 1, but now what we're interested in is what relative mix of the environment to simulate this climatic cooling over a period of decades or centuries. So this time we would have as our variable environments that are always having 11,000 objects per kilometer squared of trees and shrubs, but it's the mix of those things that matters. So you could have 10% trees and the rest shrubs, 30% trees and the rest shrubs, 50-50 mix, 70% trees and the rest shrubs, or 90% and the remainder shrubs. Excuse me. So as you move from very wooded down to much less wooded, you're simulating effectively the same environment undergoing cooling and its composition changing. As with experiment 1, what we were interested in, how accurate were participants and what sort of response distances did we find? And this didn't really give what I thought it would give at first, because we get this. Now, what's interesting here is, and we can look at the statistics as well, if an environment of the same density starts off with 90% of it filled with trees and gradually giving way to shrubs, the distance at which people were able to reliably locate this red deer did not change significantly. If you run a linear mixed effect analysis across these 4 types from 30 to 90, there is no effect for wooded vegetation percentage. If you do it from the entire data set, there is a reliable effect for wooded vegetation. And if you do it between the 10% wooded rest shrubs and all of these other ones, there again are reliable effects. So that suggests that, counterintuitive to what you might expect, there didn't appear to be a linear relationship between an environment becoming less and less and less wooded and people being able to spot prey at greater and greater distances. We also just followed this up with some t-tests. If you do t-tests to compare the means of all of these pairwise with each other, between the 30-50, 30-70, 30-90, 50-70 and 70-90, there is no significant difference between the mean prey detection distance that people had, whereas between this 10% one and all these other ones, there is. So what would that mean if you were potentially, because as I said, we accept there are problems relating this exactly to the real world, but let's have a look. So if you're in an environment which is gradually changing its density, becoming more dense or less dense, but not changing in its composition, there may not become a sudden cutoff point where your prey detection distance, the distance at which you can reliably detect prey suddenly changes. What it would mean is that it might be easier to adapt to that kind of change. Hunting strategies that have always worked may be able to carry on being used for a while. Decreasing prey detection ability as density increases is expected as there's more objects. But interestingly, with experiment 2, in an environment which is changing in composition from more wooded to less wooded, your ability to locate prey at a given distance may not be affected until a certain point in that transition is reached here, and then things might change quite quickly in the course of much shorter period of time. What it means is that type of change may be less easy to adapt to, and hunting strategies which rely on being able to locate prey at a certain distance may become viable or unviable. Like, say, for example, if pursuit hunting, you need to locate prey at a greater distance and the environment changes such that you can't reliably do that, then that strategy may become less relevant, or throwing spears at a given distance, whichever it is. That's what we've been doing so far. Then, like I said, we've been working with Chris Stringer on this. He was particularly interested in saying, well, can you take these kinds of environments and do them with different light levels? So, for animals that are out at much darker, like at sunset or sunrise, how much harder are they to locate than the same thing during midday? So we started making an experiment 3, and the plans changed because we had the experiment ready for piloting, ready to run in March. And if you've been following the news, a lot happened since then. It means that we can't bring participants into the lab anymore. We were going to investigate the amount of available light by basically having participants wear these special pairs of glasses that we made. And what they would do is you have like filters in the glasses which actually block light from hitting the eye. So we can say, well, here's the same scene, but with only 50% of the light from it available to the participant. We would then follow that up with a much more naturalistic environment experiment, looking at different times of day, sunrise, sunset, midday, to get animals that are typically crepuscular in their nature, active at dawn and dusk. We can't bring people in. So that experiment, and the nature of this experiment means it can't be moved online. So we're going to have to rethink that and maybe do it when things get back to normal. What we've done instead, which you may find interesting, we're using these kinds of environments now, much more dense, and we're looking at camouflage or different colorations of animals using exactly the same, well, not exactly the same, but using a slightly modified methodology. So if you look at our 4 deer here, these are all fallow deer. We've got an albino fallow over here, dark fallow here, and then these two are the same type of spotted fallow deer, but one just has the spots removed. And what we can see is, in an environment like this one here, at what distances do certain deer become more or less easy to spot? You would expect that the albino deer might produce something similar to a pop-out effect at no matter what distance it is, like similar to the red circle amongst the green circles. If there's one of these standing within, what, 70 meters, 90 meters, it might pop out. I'll let you know when we do the experiment. Conversely, for the dark deer, this should be much harder to spot. So once it's above a certain distance away, the hypothesis is that it's going to blend in with its background a lot more. And then the reason why we've got these 2 deer here is really the effects of the dots on them, because again, the way the visual system works, at least in modern humans, if you've got an object like this with lots of dapples on it and it's far enough away from you, you can't really resolve those dots. And so it will just look exactly like this other one, but maybe slightly lighter. And so the question would be, do the dapples make a difference up close but not far away, or the other way around? Basically that. So that's what we've been doing. I feel like I've gone through that quite quickly, but that's our methodology. As I say, we draw on visual search research, use a lot of computer science to make this ready to investigate questions to do with real environments. I think I'm ready for any questions. I realized that was a bit fast, I apologize.